Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Dev Diary. It's a new year, and so what better way to celebrate than making the newest idea from my to-do list a reality. So before we get too far into things, remember to leave a like if you enjoyed today's video and subscribe if you're new to the channel. And remember to also turn on notifications so you don't miss future videos. Now, the latest idea on my list was for a game mechanic, which just so happened to also allow me to start work on a Metal Gear demake, which I've actually been wanting to do for a while. The project is inspired by the VR missions aesthetic from Metal Gear and uses the level generator that also powers our Backrooms and Lethal Company demakes. We'll get to that game mechanic in a bit, but generally speaking, the concept is basically, what if you played Metal Gear but from the perspective of the minimap? So the player controls as you would expect for a top-down perspective, allowing the firing of their gun with left click. Now, you may notice that the player's laser sight comes in different colors. 3 to be exact. This is part of the new game mechanic idea mentioned earlier. The player can switch between these 3 colors at any time. And if the player holds spacebar, the map will zoom out and a circle begins to grow from the player. Enemies who are caught in this circle are displayed as a silhouette of one of those 3 colors, which is determined when they're spawned. So you might be able to tell where we're going with this. The player must shoot the enemy with the same laser color equipped. Now again, this is just a concept test, so you could imagine it as something more interesting lore-wise, like maybe each color represents a different bullet type, armor piercing and whatnot. Anyway, it's important to note that the player's movement slows down significantly when using this mechanic, which is why I thought it worked best in a stealth game. And before we move on, I feel the need to bring this up now that I'm looking at the footage. This is essentially detective vision from Batman or, eagle vision from Assassin's Creed. So if anything, hey, I accidentally remade detective vision / eagle vision. Now, because this was a stealth game, we needed our enemies to behave in a certain way. So the enemy was broken down into 5 states. Idle, which would have the enemy simply stand in place and look around, and this would be the default state. The patrol state is just that, the enemy chooses a random destination and walks there if possible. The alert state is the initiation state to discovering the player, which will record where the player was last seen. This will also switch all nearby enemies to their alert state, attracting them to the recorded position. It's basically the exclamation point moment from the Metal Gear Solid games. Now the chase state is also pretty basic, the enemy will simply follow the player, and if the enemy gets within attack range, they will take a shot at the player. Which brings us to the final state, the attack state. The enemy will continue to take shots at the player while they are within range. If the player runs out of range, the enemy will switch back to their chase state and repeat the process. They will eventually give up if the player has been out of sight long enough, and the general alert phase will also eventually return to neutral over time, but the player must remain out of any lines of sight until then. Speaking of line of sight, both player and enemy use the same function to determine their vision. The function itself simply checks for a wall, and if that wall is closer than their target, it's assumed that there is no direct line of sight. The function also has an optional attack parameter, meaning the unit can immediately attack upon seeing their target. Also, just to make sure things are a bit more fun, if the player attacks an enemy with the wrong laser equipped, it's an automatic full alert. And finally, when enemies are successfully taken down, they leave behind a corpse. Now this works similarly to the HTML5 game that I made recently, if you want a better idea of how that works. And the original idea was to have the bodies remain independent objects, so enemies could discover them or be hidden by the player. This would obviously set off the alert when found, only enemies would hone in on that corpse instead of the player's position. And if I'm being totally honest, the current AI isn't very fun to play with, and it's all thanks to, as usual, a lack of time. I had to cut a lot of added features to make sure I had time to release this video. The entire concept was very fun to put together, but also very time consuming. Getting the surfaces to work with the circle vision effect was a little annoying. There's still obviously areas I need to improve, especially when it comes to masking. And this was the first time I ever coded any type of real stealth AI, so for what it is, it's not terrible, but I think things like vision cones and better spaced out sequences / behavior between states would ultimately be better. But again, that's part of the fun, right? Each project helps you practice and get closer to that end goal, and that's what this was. So while there's definite room for improvement, this was a great way to just kick off the new year of Dev Diary. And with this being the start to a new year, I want to hear what you're all planning to develop this year, or really anything on your mind. So be sure to leave your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed today's video and would like to support the channel, I am on Patreon. You can get access to some exclusive game downloads of projects previously featured on the channel, like my Backrooms demake, and you can even get early access to the weekly videos before they're on YouTube. And with that said, brings us to the end of today's Dev Diary, so thank you so much for watching. I hope your 2023 was awesome. Here's to a great 2024, and I will see you next time.